Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm happy to be here, and I'm going to present a lot of stuff. We don't have that much time, so I'm going to either speak very fast, or I'm going to have to edit at the end, and let me see how this works. So I'm going to talk a lot about my work, and my work is very place-based. I am, for better or worse, a globalized artist, so it feels a little bit like, sitting in the basement watching Uncle Felix's slideshow of his travels. So I'm going to start you in the city of Venice. In 1997, the city of Venice, a city of great architecture, a city of remarkable art history, and a city of mediocre food, but a city of incredibly disgusting mud. And that mud is at the bottom of the canals, and as you all know, there's no the canals and cause problems for boat traffic, which is all the traffic. And so the city has a navy of barges, and these barges go and dredge these canals daily. So they take the mud in the bottom of the canals, which is moving like the water, but just at a much slower rate. They fill a central container in the barge. They drive that out to the lagoon, and they dump it. And they do this over and over and over every day. So in 1997, I believe, I was invited by the Nordic Pavilion, because I am the Nordic ideal, to be their guest for the Venice Biennale. So I wanted to know what exactly was in this container. So we took the contents of one of those central containers of mud, and we put it in front of the beautiful modernist Nordic pavilion. If you've ever been to Venice at low tide, you can probably guess that this did not make us very good neighbors. The surrounding pavilions were a little bit upset with this choice of a project. So this mud it's smelly. It's very anaerobic. It has a really unusual ecology of mole shrimp and some worms and it's full of a lot of household wastes and a lot of toxic industrial waste from bygone era. But it is also impossibly archaeologically rich, right? You couldn't stick a pencil in this without it hitting something. So I wanted to find out what that something was. And I spent my entire summer removing everything and cleaning everything and building an exhibition around that. So a lot of the archaeology projects have kind of three parts. They have the dig, they have the organization, and then they have the display. In this case, you saw the material first. The next space you came to was the actual display, where I turned their storage closet into a kind of something in between a Wunderkammer and a treasure trove, right? So we all know, if you know anything about my and your erudition. And before that, the medieval tradition is you take your treasure and you hide it in the deepest dungeon or the highest tower. And so I wanted to make something that kind of referenced that border right there. So these are my treasure boxes, but I don't have precious metals. I've just got rusted, oxidized metal. I don't have emeralds. I have broken green bottles. I don't have pearls. I have crushed up shell. So I don't have a crocodile to hang from the ceiling, but I do have this amazing collection of shovel pieces that came from this. And it makes no sense for me to do these projects in a way that would recapitulate how a history museum or an archaeology museum would do them. Those places exist. They do a pretty good job of what they're doing. So I want to put together things in a way that really challenges your assumptions about how one works with this material and also what museums are for. Part of my job is really to kind of mess with your expectations about what museums are, what they do, who they're for, what they're for. And the more I work with museums, and I've been working with museums for a long time, the less sure I am what they are and what they do and what they're for. So when I put these things together, I'm putting them together in an almost childlike way. I am trying to imagine that I don't know what these things are, and putting them together in very formalistic, simplistic ways, very much like I am the proverbial Martian archaeologist who comes to this world without knowing what these things are and tries to kind of develop a language with them. As I say, one of the things I'm also like to do is mess with your expectations. So as you see, here's some of the ceramics. Venice is not an old city by Italian standards. There's no Etruscan or Roman Venice. It's a very young city and by Italian standards. So we're finding ceramics from the Middle Ages, from the Renaissance, and up to ceramics today in this sample. And as you see, everything is clearly indicated with a dot, with a number. And if you, as a viewer, try to find the reference for that number, you will go mad because it doesn't exist. So I have the signs of a didactic museum, but I don't follow through, and I want that irritation to be something that the audience experiences, because I'm not a museum. And then the last part in this section, in this case, is where you experience the process, and the notion of process is really important in my work. And I know I'm an extremely privileged person in that I get to go. Today I was looking at collections here, going through the back rooms of museums and seeing the kind of wonders and the treasures. And I also visit artist studios. I've never seen a painting that was more interesting in the museum than it was in the studio. So that having access to that, and I've never seen a museum that was more interesting in its exhibitions than it was in its storage. So having access to that, I want to kind of share that experience. So even if that sometimes is a bit theatrical, you see process in these projects. So in this case, this is the room where I prepare things, where things come out of the mud. You see objects still embedded with mud. You see things that are in the process of being cleaned. You see these kind of rudimentary systems of classification that are happening, and you see kind of roads not taken as well. So the way I arrange things isn't presented as the kind of natural way. It's just one of a variety of ways. And of course, I found an enormous amount of material here, and this was by far the worst summer of my life. I had to have hepatitis shots and tetanus shots. You had to wear a respirator. Venice is incredibly hot. The Biennale is incredibly crowded. So this was a super unpleasant thing. And I said, after this, I'm done. I'm done with these archaeology projects. Never again. So for my next archaeology project, I worked in the city of London, and I worked also on a river. And a lot of my archaeology projects relate to water for a number of reasons. For a number of metaphoric reasons, but also because I work with sites that have been disrupted. So they're not legitimate archaeological sites. They're sites where water has destroyed context in a way. And so I'm really careful not to kind of mess up someone's actual legitimate archaeological site. That these sites are kind of interesting to me because they also mix time and generations and relate a lot to, I think, our experience of history. So of course, the City of London is where it is because of the Thames. The Thames in the City of London is much, much older than Venice, and it's very easy to find Roman ceramics on the foreshore of the Thames. The Thames is a very mighty river. It's strong. It's also tidal. So twice a day, the foreshore, which is this area here, is exposed. And the foreshore is marvelously rich in material culture. There's just a lot of stuff there from centuries and centuries of human habitation in what was at various times the largest city in Europe. So there is just an enormous amount of stuff. So at this moment, there was something new happening, which was that there were now two Tates. There was one at Millbank, one at Bankside. Two parts of the city that have remarkably different social histories, and that social history kind of documented in the stuff that one would find there. So I assembled a team of volunteers. I don't know why we call them volunteers, because everybody was paid, but it sounds nicer maybe than workers. But and so they were either under 17 or over 65, so teenagers and pensioners. And you see my volunteers are in this picture. They have the safety vests. That group on the edge of the water, that's actually a coven of witches who are doing a summer solstice baptism. So the Thames is still very, very active in the magic trade, and we found just tons of objects evidencing magic from the past, but also magic being done on the river all the time. So we would identify an area, and we were instructed to remove all the human-made things from that area. And it would be quite a large area. We'd spend 4 hours a day. So 4 hours a day for 1 week at Bankside, 4 hours a day for 1 week at Millbank, amassing all this stuff, looking very hard. This is Hamsini and Alexis, two of the people I worked with. They had this incredible ability to find things. They just had this kind of highly developed search image in their back of their mind. They're thinking of artifacts, and they're finding needles and pins from, the London Bridge that partially tumbled into the Thames was the center of the needle, pin, wire, nail, and metal trade. And so they're finding these brass pins, and just an incredibly developed acumen. And some people, of course, were utterly hopeless and completely unable to tell the difference between a human-made thing and an interestingly shaped rock. But I could go with that, and that was really interesting for me. Those were some of my favorite things that we found, were things that were either nature, the natural and the artificial combined together, or the natural mimic to the artificial. So this is my team of pirates on one particular day, and also Francis Morris is there with the curator of the Tate. So the next stage, after these 2 weeks of collecting, was to bring the literally tens of thousands of things we found and site them on the lawn of the Tate. So this is kind of like building these Indiana Jones tents, colonizing the colonizer there. And imagine the steps of the Art Institute in the summer, or the steps of the Metropolitan. This lawn is really packed in the summer, so we had to put up this tape. And we were active all summer long there, cleaning. The idea was, unless you were an obvious lunatic, you were really allowed to go behind the tape and hang out with us. So people did. People came, and people came back, and they tended to treat us a little bit like the Antiques Roadshow. They wanted to know what was the most valuable thing we found, or what was the oldest thing we found. And by the end, of course, people were bringing us things. But we also had these great guests, like Peter Blake would come and just show us stuff that he found, in the 60s in the Thames. I mean, it's just kind of extraordinary. And people like this very well-dressed dandy could come and spend time and poke around. Every day at lunch we had guest lecturers who would talk about the Thames. So those would be archaeologists, social historians, art historians, also people who had a practical relationship with the Thames, like the police force, the Thames police force, or the harbor master. So we were kind of doing the research about the project in the project, which was really interesting. By the end of the summer, my team and I really knew a lot about the Thames from having these great experts come. And needless to say, this is an incredibly challenging thing to clean. Every single thing that we found, every fragment of glass, every bit of bone, every coin, every bit of plastic was cleaned, cataloged. This is just some of the stuff from Bankside, which of course at one time had a lot of slaughterhouses and vinegar factories. So everything is clean. So first we clean all the glass, and then we begin to divide the glass into clear glass, green glass, brown glass, bottle necks, bottle bottoms, bottle fragments that have writing on them, etc., etc. So refining and refining and refining until finally we're done for the summer. We shut down, and the project goes to sleep and reappears some months later as this very elaborately made double-sided cabinet, right? So double-sided, of course, because it implies that one side, of course, has Millbank finds, one Bankside finds, double-sided implying that you could compare them and contrast the social histories through this material culture, except I don't really show the same things on both sides. So again, I'm trying to frustrate that most obvious expectation you might have. But this does contain 99% of what we found, except for a shopping cart, a few tires, a dead dog. Everything else is pretty much in here in some way. And so these cabinets are really very, very full. And sometimes some of the things are not on display, so I couldn't show you every human tooth, every credit card, every cell phone, every battery, every bullet, every key, every toy, every message in a bottle that we found. So these boxes kind of indicate that this could all have been reorganized a very different way. And like a lot of early collections, like the Pitt Rivers and like the British Museum, it has an interactive aspect that you were able to open up drawers, and in those drawers you would see things organized by very different principles. So you'd try to imagine what is the principle of organizing this cabinet, and you'd open it, and the first drawer would be maybe plastic bottle caps, and they're organized by the color spectrum. And the next drawer, it might be ceramic fragments, and they're organized by size. And the next drawer, it might be objects organized by utility. And so each time you try to figure out what's the system changes. And what you end up with, of course, is a kind of encyclopedia of systems, an encyclopedia of ways we might put things together, right? This is an image from our, what I call the greatest hits drawer, which has bullets from the Second World War, and a few of the rings we found, and teeth from the bears from the bear baiting pits, and fragments from medieval lice combs, and 16th century ceramics, 400 million year old sea urchin fossil, a voodoo doll, a child's shoe from the Renaissance, like just great stuff. And then the last part of this are photographs of all the people who worked on the project. So I like this because, again, I'm interested in that notion of process, but also, like a lot of people work on projects like this, and when you have, like a lot of people work on movies, and at the end of the movie, you have this thing called the credits that we all walk out on, but nevertheless scrolls up, and then you see all the people who contributed and did something, and we don't really have a kind of an etiquette for that, I think, in the art world, and we do kind of need one, or at least for these kinds of projects. So this, for me, is a very eloquent way of doing that. And it shows not only the people who were in the dig and did the cleaning, but also people like, the Tate publicity staff and the video team and the curator and the project manager, people who are really, that kind of labor is totally invisible in the art world. So it was an interesting way to try to imagine how we could do that. Okay, so that was the archaeology part, part one. Part two, there's only 7 parts of this lecture, is we're going to talk about follies. And, I'm really interested in public art. I work a lot in the realm of public art, and I think you probably all will agree that there is no artistic realm which has more aesthetic crimes than public art, right? I mean, public art can be the worst, and often is. And so I'm always thinking, like, what would be interesting models for public art? And one of those, I think, is the Folly, is the kind of, this notion of diminutive structures that are meant to produce meaning, that are buildings that are intended to be discursive rather than have a practical function, have a function of meaning making, of situation creating. So all of this work, all of my work is very place-based, right? Place is what it's all about. It's the site says everything. It all proceeds from the site. So I have to talk a little bit about the site whenever I talk about these pieces. So this is on the border of the United States and Mexico and Tijuana. This is the Tijuana Estuary National Wildlife Reserve. And this was once a garbage dump on the border. And then during the Second World War, this is where the Navy tested their bombardment strategies. And now, of course, it's on the border. That means people are sneaking across the border, and people are stopping people from sneaking across the border. On one side of it is the Imperial Beach development. So those developers would love to keep developing this property right up to the border. It's also surrounded by sprawling suburbs where teenagers with their BMX bikes like to ride in the park, of course, and rangers like to stop them from riding in the park. And it's adjacent to where the Navy tests or trains its helicopter pilots. So you cannot be here without 1 to 4 helicopters flying overhead, often with Navy SEALs dangling from them. So this is not the most restful wildlife refuge you've ever heard of. But if you're a fish who has to swim upriver, this is your best shot in many miles of the border, up the Tijuana mouth. If you're a bird who needs to lay your eggs on a beach, this is your best shot. If you're a garbage-eating raccoon, squirrel, possum, skunk, this is probably where you sleep the day off. So a lot of animals are kind of shoehorned in, and it's on the migratory path. So I liked this landscape of mischief, right? This is a place that has a total history of mischief. I wanted to have the architectural vernacular of mischief, a building that looks like it's built to not be seen in a way. And So how you see this piece is you go to the Park Service, you give them your ID, they give you a key, you walk out about 2.5 miles, which means none of my friends from New York saw this, and then you are on the site of a beautiful bomb crater, which is flooded and filled with lots of waterfall. And you open this up, you kind of literally open the door, and it all opens like a transformer, and suddenly you are in a mecca for bird watchers. And as you all know, birding is the fastest growing American outdoor activity right now. And this place is full of things that are important for birders, like silhouettes and maps and charts and lists and optics and recording devices and lots of books and outdoor gear and watercolors. And so you can come there and spend, 20 minutes, the entire day, at a very prominent bird site. And so inside it's all are things about the culture of birds. So this is a kind of hall of fame. People who've done a lot for birds, like Marjorie Stoneham Douglas and Rachel Carson and Roger Torrey Peterson and Aldo Leopold. There are these photographs that are like they're like the triumph of nature photography. Birds up close in their environment, except that they're taken in dioramas like the ones across the street. So they're actually dead birds in very old dioramas. There's some x-rays of birds who've run into problems in the park and been rehabilitated. There's a chart in case you want to build a bird. So as I said, like the people in New York wouldn't go to this, so they were jealous and we had to bring one to them. So this is in Madison Square Park, which is the park on 23rd Street near the Flatiron Building. And this is the Urban Wildlife Observation Unit. So the Urban Wildlife Observation Unit carefully looks out onto the landscape of Madison Square Park and observes the plants and animals that you can see there, which, Madison Square Park probably has the biodiversity of one of your parking lots here. So in accordance with that, I manned it with a very talented, really interesting DJ who was probably the most ignorant person of the natural world I'd ever met. So he could not tell you anything about what you were seeing out in the world, but his job was to encourage you to come in, and part of his job was also to, you see, we changed the aesthetic. So the aesthetic of the one in San Diego was a little more like Army surplus kind of 1948 kind of, this is more Roosevelt era, American Museum of Natural History, wood, and we have a diorama in there which features pigeons and rats and cockroaches. And we also, these are featured in our field guide to the wildlife at Madison Square Park, which has entries for things like grass and squirrels and pigeons and all of the kinds of wildlife you might actually encounter. So as I said, my work is very place-based, and how this functions for me mostly, and this is really kind of, I'm focusing on one kind of work, which is really field work, what I call field work. So I go to a site, in this case, this is outside of Essen in Germany, and Essen was the cultural capital of Europe some years ago, and I go on a bitter cold February, and I know I want to work at a place where there's a lot of water issues in Essen, so I know I want to work where the water and the land meet. So we go there, it's freezing, it's bitter, and there's nothing around except a little, it looks like a kind of construction cabin, and there's smoke coming out of the chimney. So my host says, I think we can get a coffee in there. It's freezing, it's 9 in the morning, it's well below zero. So we run there, open the door, and out billows cigarette smoke, like we're overwhelmed. And inside, we hear the roar of laughter, and we look in, and there are tables of very large men who are drinking beers and schnapps at 9 in the morning. And there's a bar, and there's kind of pin-up girl pictures behind the bar. The walls of this place are like caramel colored from years of cigarette smoke. It has the kind of ambience of a high school boy's locker room, And I say, what is this place? And they say, oh, this is the fishing club. I said, the fishing club, when is fishing season? Oh, it's in May. So I thought, that's amazing. So these guys love particular animals, fish, and they bond every day, and they have an entire cultural life based on their relationship to an animal. I want to make something like that, but I'm not interested in making it for machos. I want to make something for dandies. So I worked with the sewage treatment plant people, with the apprentices for the sewage treatment plant, and we found this great oxygen tank. This used to pump oxygen into the sewage treatment plant, and we modified it. We built this great tower on it. We built a hobbit door. We built some observation windows. And this is the Amateur Ornithologist Club. So the Amateur Ornithologist Club is where gentle folk might come and discourse on our feathered friends and perhaps consult the books that are there. You can bring your picnic and dine on bird-themed china. You can use the various optics and photographic devices, recording devices. This one actually has an attendant, so she will help you identify birds, introduce you to the culture of bird identification. There's a frieze of famous people who have done a lot for birds, or a lot for bird identification. There's a lot of great cultural stuff. It is still very much a club, and like all clubs, it's about drinking and smoking. But here you can only drink wild turkey, or cockspur, or famous grouse, or gray goose, or Parrot Bay rum, and you can only smoke larks, of course. And because it's Germany, there's just great kitsch around the culture of nature, and so it's a great opportunity to look at this incredible, like the diversity of the culture of nature, specifically with regards to birds, and everything in here kind of relates to birds in a very particular way. Another site that I was working on recently was, this is Folkestone. Folkestone is on the channel between in England. On a clear day, you can easily see France. Folkestone is one of these seaside towns that in the Edwardian time was fantastically wealthy and built wonderful hotels. In the early 20th century, people like Bernard Shaw had houses there, and H.G. Wells had a house there. The Prince of Wales would take his mistress there. I mean, it was just this kind of fantastic place. British people don't go to vacation in places like here. They go to places like Ibiza now. But before that, people came here to go to the beach. And since then, it's really fallen on quite hard times. But it's still a fantastic place. And to bring attention to that, they created a sculpture triennial. So every 3 years, international artists from around the world descend on this place and try to make things that make sense. So when I come to a place like this, I'm really trying to pick up the thread. I'm trying to find what is the thing here that's worth engaging, that's interesting for me, for my baggage that I bring with me on a trip like this, but also relates to the culture of the place that maybe is so close people there can't even see it anymore. And what I found that was really striking about Folkestone is I'd never been anywhere where people hated seagulls so much. And there was this kind of venom about gulls, and people hated gulls because some people loved gulls too much, right? And those people taught gulls all these bad manners. And gulls are incredibly intelligent animals with very flexible behavior. They learn, and so they associate people with food. And there's a gull in Folkestone who knows how the electronic door works at Tesco and walks into the Tesco and grabs a bag of chips, or they would call them crisps, and walks out, opens them, and all the gulls eat them. When you come out on Friday with your fish and chips, the gull will swoop behind you at 60 miles an hour, knocking your french fries onto the ground, and all the gulls come, and it seems like they're laughing at you, but they're not. But gulls have been studied by ethologists for such a long time. They're animals that we know really, really a lot about, and it may not be possible to speak gull, but it's quite possible to understand a lot of what gulls are saying. And what gulls obviously have is a PR problem, right? So what they really need is a mobile gull appreciation unit. So the mobile gull appreciation unit travels around the city of Folkestone, and my trained gull enthusiasts teach people how to identify different species of gulls, teach people some aspect of learning to talk gull or learning to understand what gulls are doing, and we visit all the tourist sites that people might go and try to convince people. I mean, I'm absolutely positive that to know gulls is to love gulls, and so what we found out through this was that Folkestone wasn't filled with gull haters. The gull haters were just this noisy, grouchy minority, not unlike the Tea Party perhaps. And they just seemed like there were more of them than there are. And in fact, people had very positive stories about gulls, and we ended up being this kind of clearinghouse for these really charming. A lot of people had raised gulls from chicks. A lot of people had rescued gulls. A lot of people had very funny stories about gulls. So it turned out that we imagined that Folkestone was more hostile toward gulls than they were. And of course, we made a book, so you can take lessons in speaking gull. One of the largest of the projects that relates to site is called the Seattle Vivarium, or it's actually now called the Newcomb Vivarium because Mr. Newcomb paid for it. And so this is one of the largest and most ambitious of these works. So I was invited to go to Seattle to work in the new Olympic Sculpture Park, which was this incredibly polluted petroleum transfer zone, which the Seattle Art Museum quietly bought, found out it wasn't so bad, remediated the soil, and created this sculpture park really right in the heart of the city. And Louise Bourgeois, Richard Serra, Teresita Fernandez, and I did new commissions for the opening of the park, which was fantastic. And a lot of work from people like Oldenburg and Calder was moved to the park. So it's a great sculpture park, and it's what's I think the greatest thing about it is that it really is in the heart of Seattle. And it's not a lot of open space in downtown Seattle, so it's great. So I started going there and thinking about what to do, and one of the things I wanted to do when I went out there was to go visit the forests around Seattle, some of which are, they're all mostly temperate rainforests, but they are also forests that have never been cut down. You know, I grew up in New England. I spent a lot of time in forests. Those forests were cut down 3 or 4 times before I was ever born. So to go to a forest and see all the parts intact is an incredibly interesting experience. And because they're rainforests, that means they get at least 100 inches of rain. All of the nutrients that we think about might be washed out to sea quickly, except those nutrients are really bound in the vegetation itself. So that energy is in the tree. And when one of these giants falls, it begins to release that energy, and the next generation of forest is very quick to take advantage of that. And these are called nurse logs. So I wanted to take a nurse log out of the forest as an ambassador and bring it back into downtown Seattle. And it's interesting to see, like, you know, these trees were in the city not so long ago. The entire European settlement of Seattle happens post-photography, right? So we can see the entire thing. It's kind of an extraordinary, I don't know of another city on that scale where that happens. So we had to find the right tree, though. The National Park Service were like, we love the project. To get a tree out of the national park, the paperwork would spread from here to Washington, D.C. and back. There's just no way it's going to happen. The Seattle Art Museum is sponsored by some of the worst forestry criminals, like the Weyerhaeuser Corporation. And they were like, we'd love to give you a tree. Just how big and where do you want it? We'll just helicopter it in. So we couldn't do that. And so we found out that the watershed actually has a different way of managing their forest, and they have an education component. We found a tree. We knew exactly the day that this fell down in a windstorm. It was just off the road, so that meant we didn't have to build a road to get the tree, which was good. We couldn't helicopter it because it's too heavy. So we removed it on what just happened to be the hottest day of the year, which is not so great. We brought that into the sculpture park, set it, and then we built the building around it. And this is the Newcomb Vivarium. And everything about this building is to recapitulate the situation that the tree was in. You know, we're trying to replicate the conditions that the tree was found in. So, the skylight is green because we worked with lighting engineers to see what kind of color spectrum you have at the bottom of the canopy. We know what the temperature is in this place year-round, so the building is programmed to reproduce that temperature. The mist, the humidity, there are shades. So being in this is a little bit like being in the belly of a whale. It's really alive. So when you're in there, their shutters are going up for ventilation, or the fans are going on, or the misters are going on, or the shades are coming down. The building is constantly regulating itself to be like the forest that it came from. You enter through this little vestibule that tells you a little bit about where the tree came from. And there are these message boards that also talk about all of the people who worked on this project. The hydrologists, foresters, environmental education people, architects, everyone who helped me, the tile makers. illustrators. So these kind of go on, but again, it's a way of trying to find a way to acknowledge that kind of labor. But then you're in the room, and this is a work that really affects the senses. You know, when you step into this room, the quality of the air is different. Of course, the sound is different. It smells like you're in the forest, and so all of the senses are kind of there. And unlike maybe a natural history exhibit where things are behind glass, the tree is really kind of there, right? And you see the apparatus that keeps this tree doing what it's supposed to do, which is decaying and releasing its energy for another generation of plants, animals, fungi. So all of that apparatus is very visible. We really try to make the services that the forest has and does every day into their technological equivalent, which is a lot of technology. There's a lot of heavy lifting that this building has to do, which I think is a little bit about talking about what happens when you lose a system like that. And there's the tree. It's right there in front of you. This is funny for me because this is like the first day, so you see how tiny. This is this is a spa for ferns, right? When we put these ferns like grow to 5 feet in no time at all, and we have to take these pathetic little ferns out, put them in the garden, and take their ferns and put them back in the vivarium where they get all pumped up again. And so this is a really ideal condition for the things that grow in there. We also have to harvest the insects out in the field and bring them back in because they all fly out in the springtime usually. We have to what is that called? Weed the thing, because of course everyone comes in there and plants pot seeds. I mean, this is just, it's Seattle. So, and there are, there are these tiles which show you some of the organisms you might see on and around the tree, some of the beetles, the isopods, the mollusks, worms. Some of which you will definitely see if you're there, and some of which you may not. And but we also, we don't have a full ecosystem here. We don't have a snowpack. We don't have woodpeckers. We don't have chipmunks. So there's a lot of things missing. And so this is not something ever intended to be entirely successful. But it's a way of talking about this kind of phenomena. And again, there's this frieze along the top of people who really inspired the thinking around this. So people like Robert Smithson and also Ehrlich, who's a great writer who's been, Paul Ehrlich, really inspirational to me. And here you see it in the landscape with this kind of Michael Heitzer. Then there's the vivarium. Then there's one of Roxy Payne's trees behind that. There's even a tiny little Ellsworth Kelly. And then, of course, there's this creepy Space Needle. And, of course, this also has a field guide, which tells you who are the people on the, gives a little bit of background about this specific tree, about what kind of things went on during this tree's life. The tree's about 160 years old. It's a western hemlock. So we wanted to have a tree that was somehow significant. That's the state tree of Washington. Anyway, there's lots of information there. Another project working on this is the biological field station that was done in the city of Hamburg. We convinced the city of Hamburg to give us a barge. We then built a deck on the barge, and we built a structure on the barge, and we created the collaboration between soil scientists, botanists, and artists. And this traveled around the city of Hamburg. Hamburg has more miles of canals than Venice does, believe it or not. And we could move around, and each of those groups kind of either together or separately could use the barge as a platform for collecting, for taking samples, for drinking beer, or I'm not sure what the artists did, but so we could all do this. And in a way, it's very much like this kind of dream of the university where you have these amazing talents who are under this umbrella of an organization and could be talking to each other, but often aren't. So this was a kind of place where we did have a lot of cross-pollination, and also it became a platform not just for us, but for other people as well. So a lot of people came to us with ideas about how they would use the space, and we were incredibly accommodating. So, and of course we used the space for helping with the botanical survey and having a kind of really fruitful discussion. In the evening, the soil scientists had their annual conference there, which is probably the only soil science conference ever to be attended by artists, I would imagine. And people would come to us and say, oh, I want to make drawing machines that are activated by the wave motion and hang them from the barge. And we said, oh yeah, no problem. And the scuba diving club said, we'd like to use the barge as a platform to dive to do a dive in the Ulster. And we said, no problem. And someone wanted to work with children, teaching them nature illustration using our taxidermy collection and our living collection of fishes and things. And we said, great, no problem. Someone wanted to read the Odyssey by firelight at midnight, and we said, no problem. And someone wanted to have a rave, and we said, no. So, but I mean, that idea of using this as a kind of, having this function as a sculpture that was also a platform that also encouraged interactions was kind of how that happened. So as I said, a lot of, how are we doing on time? I'm just going to keep pushing. Okay, so now we're in Houston, Texas. This is the Buffalo Bayou, which is one of the most neglected urban rivers. It's really not a very strong aspect of the city of Houston. And although, of course, it is the reason for Houston being there, people got so sick of being beaten up by hurricanes in Galveston, they followed the Buffalo Bayou up and established Houston, Texas. And the Buffalo Bayou has the unfortunately has a situation where it flows through very affluent neighborhoods. And in those affluent neighborhoods, people love to garden, and they garden with incredibly elaborate invasive plants. And those seeds from those plants get in the river, and then they float downriver, and they create ecological catastrophe at the other end of the Buffalo Bayou, and have completely changed the ecology of the more natural parts at the mouth of this river. So there's an organization that takes care of the river that is trying to encourage people not to plant highly invasive exotic things in their gardens. This is not so easy. So they commissioned for me a tool to help them do this. And what I found out when I started talking to them is if we have a program on planting indigenous plants, maybe 4 or 5 people will show up. And if we have another program giving away plants, maybe 12 people might come over the course of an entire day. But if they sponsored an exotic plant eradication day, you would have an army of people, Texans, very happy to kill non-native things, right? So I wanted to kind of make a little fun of that, but at the same time provide them with a useful tool. So we built this kind of ice cream truck, taco truck-like swap van, and this actually has a very practical function in the arsenal of the war against invasive species. So this is where in the morning, when we have one of these invasive species eradication events, people get their orientation, because a lot of the people who want to kill non-native plants need to know exactly which plants are the non-native plants, and it may not be so easy to discern, so we have to kind of educate them about that. This is where, of course, all the tools to do these dastardly deeds are kept, and this is where we have orientation, where everyone has their lunch, and like all wars, there is a propaganda aspect of the war as well, so this goes around to street fairs and things like that, and we try very hard to kind of educate people on which things are really should not be planted in neighborhood gardens. And of course, there's a field guide that goes with that. It sounds like I should be selling these field guides, but I'm not. Okay, so that was the second part. We're into the third and last part, which is I do a lot of collaborations with collecting institutions, so either with museums or with universities. And universities collect very aggressively, and all universities collect, not all universities think they collect. So some universities like here have actual collecting institutions, have museums, but there's always, of course, study collections, and there are collections of things that end up in the archives, the way that the institution tells its own story through things that are collected. There are things that just get too old and are just too good to throw away, so they suddenly become part of the collection. There are all sorts of collections. There are people's Hello Kitty collections at their desk. So universities collect. And And I was hired to be part of a large history of science exhibition, modestly titled Weltwissen, World Knowledge, 300 Years of Science in Berlin. So, which begins with the establishing of the Charity Hospital, the first teaching hospital in Berlin, 300 years ago. And so this is a very complicated and wonderfully researched, thorough exhibition with exhibitions on the history of the development of art history, with the history of chemistry, physics in Berlin, the story of the Nazi perversion of science during the 30s. So it's an incredibly sophisticated, great exhibition, but they needed something to start the exhibition. I always think this is a little bit like designing the book cover or something. So I created this enormous cabinet. Each one of these cubes is 6 by 6 feet. So this is that thing at the bottom is a person. So this is a very, and not only it is also torqued. So it's a hemisphere. So it is curved both horizontally and vertically, and torqued. But you don't see it first like this. You see it from behind. So you enter the space and you see rather the silhouettes of things. And so these kind of lines that you see help you understand that this is actually a shaped vitrine as well. So you encounter everything almost like the Platonic world of ideas, like this kind of these kind of ideal forms, and then you come around and you see the actual objects, all of which relate to the history of science as was studied. We have the natural sciences on the far left, starting with geology and going to geology, mineralogy, paleontology, then going to the natural sciences, then to physical anthropology, then to the history of medicine, then to cultural anthropology, and then to the abstract sciences, to information science, to engineering, chemistry, et cetera, et cetera. This is an incredibly hard exhibition to do. It took years to find these objects. Many of these collections were not organized, so I had to go and search for things in long forgotten attics and basements. Things were stored under the train tracks, but also some of the collections are very formal, and you have to imagine the difficulty, my embarrassment going to, say, the expert on Egypt, you know, one of the most knowledgeable Egyptologists in the world, and saying, "Hey, you got something about Egypt? And could it be like the size of a washing machine or something?" So it was very, this is a hard thing to do because every department really just gets one cubicle. So, and how to organize that, it just took a lot of planning and scheming, and there also are telescopes which you can look through, and the telescopes are cued to computer programs that will tell you what things are. So when you look at the horse skeleton, you'll find out that that's the Emperor Maximilian's favorite horse, which he had flayed after its death and the skeleton preserved, and that normally sits at the entrance of his palace. And you'll see the first iron lung, and it will tell you about that. You'll see one of the speakers that was at Hitler's Nuremberg rally. So each of these objects has a lot of resonance, and there are ways to kind of get into what these things are, how these artifacts embody history. Okay, this is the last project I want to mention. This is the Museum of Oceanography in Monaco. The first Prince Albert was not only the king of Monaco, was not only the head of state, not only owned all the casinos, but he was a very decent whale systematics scientist. So he was a whale taxonomist, a cetacean taxonomist. And whenever he could get away from the state and his duties, he had a boat that was filled with oceanographers, climatologists, and marine biologists, and they would sail to the Arctic or to the Azores studying the sea, studying the currents, studying the upper atmosphere and the ecology within the upper atmosphere, sampling from the deepest parts of the ocean, and he built a temple to the sea, which was based on the marriage of art and science. So he took Ernst Haeckel, the famous German evolutionary biologist, and the publisher of Art Forms in Nature, which is still in print today. This book obsessed with the notion of symmetry. So Haeckel came and advised him about the decorations here. This is the most decorous natural history museum in the world. That makes the American Museum of Natural History look like a Costco, right? But everything, all the gargoyles are real things in the world. So the gargoyles are not fictive monsters, but walrus and pelicans and orcas, and the gates are octopi, and the tiling on the floor depicts deep sea fishes, and the main chandelier is in the form of Haeckel's Medusa, his jellyfish sculpture. The sconces on the walls are seahorses. I mean, it's just incredible. And this is what it looked like in 1910. Needless to say, 1910, that was built. There's a lot of other options for how one might build a building at that time, right? This is a real throwback to a different era, in the same way that there may be, well, here's the displays in 1910. So this is the Marine Vertebrate Hall. This is the Hall of Oceanography, where they show off everything that they made to sample from the sea. Had to be made from scratch, right? They didn't order it from the BioQuip catalog. They actually had to go and construct everything and to create all of the things, the kites that would sample the upper atmosphere, the nets that would go to the bottom of the ocean and attract these crabs which have never been described before. So this kind of celebrates their endeavor. This is, of course, the whale room. That was his favorite place. And so this museum went on for a very long time. In I believe the early 70s or maybe the late 60s, Jacques Cousteau, who is a great hero of mine, a great filmmaker and conservationist and public intellectual, but perhaps not the best museum director. And he kind of scrapped a lot of the historic stuff and took a lot of the stuff off exhibit and kind of ruined the museum in a way. But he used his time in Monaco to meet absurdly wealthy tax dodgers, and they funded his films, which is why people go to Monaco today. And so now the museum has tried to restore itself in the best possible way to its historic self. The museum is 2 floors of museum, 2 floors of aquarium, and 7 subterranean floors of biological laboratories. So this is like a dream for anyone who's interested in marine biology. I mean, it really is kind of an extraordinary place. And it's built on the sea, and it's built a long time ago. So you can imagine the rust. It's kind of crazy. So anyway, they've tried to restore the museum. They see the museum part more as now really a history of science exhibit. They are still intensely invested in marine conservation. They do a lot of conferences. They do temporary exhibitions on conservation issues. They still publish scientific papers. There are many biologists who still work there. But the museum itself, they really see as a museum of a museum now, or for the most part, at least the 2nd floor. So they asked me to integrate a lot of my works into that. A lot of my sculptures kind of look like the museum already, so it's really hard to tell where my sculptures fit into that. But more importantly, they wanted to deal with the situation of most museums exhibit between 1% and 10% of what they have. There's always this problem of how do we get more things out? And part of the story that's not told in the museum is the story of the museum. And so they commissioned me to kind of find a way to move forward and to get a lot of this stuff out of the basement. So I started, all my works kind of start with these red and blue drawings, which I've been doing forever. And I took on that kind of model of the Wunderkammer and tried to imagine a way forward by looking back at the kind of eclectic and heterogeneous activities that go on. And my wife and I spent a year snooping around the basement of the Natural History Museum, trying to find and finding remarkable scientific instruments. There's a whole part of the museum that was once based on the industry of marine, of building arts and crafts with marine objects. So carved shells and cameos and pearls and coral. So all of that hadn't been exhibited forever. The wet preparations, of course, are amazing there. We have preparations from all of the Cousteau expeditions. And then this is the Oceanomania cabinet. So this is the permanent new installation. You have to imagine this was once a white wall in the middle of the entrance to the second floor of the museum. So I found in storage all the original cabinetry. We refitted that cabinetry. The bottom layer is all of the scientific publications, and this place has made scientific publications before there was actually a building, so from 1900 on, and continues to do scientific publications. On the left side, we have the kind of natural world, and a lot of the collections that, of course, never would be seen, like their Bryozoan collection. I mean, when are they ever going to show their Bryozoans? But the Bryozoans are great. I think they're great. And then we have the wet collections, and we have some of their really paradigmatic, amazing specimens, like one of the polar bears and these fantastic billfish. And on the other side, we have the scientific instruments, the various artworks that are made with the sea, a fragment of their painting collection, and of course the story of Cousteau and Albert and the other directors who have been there. So, yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about Mildred's Lane and how that fits into your practice.
Thank you. Yeah, I think before I showed slides, I was showing slides from Mildred's Lane. Mildred's Lane is this artist residency program I run in Pennsylvania with the artist J. Morgan Pewitt, and it is a place that really tries to encourage artists, architects, social critics, art historians, museum directors, to come and explore kind of collaborative work. And unlike other residencies where you go and work on your own projects, you kind of check your agenda at the door, and you work under a kind of team of master artists. Sometimes it will be like an artist and a sociologist, or sometimes it will be a landscape architect and artist. And they come up with a kind of project in a field of investigation, and you explore that with them, and the team get together and create a kind of quite discursive and very energetic situation to discuss these things. And all of these projects, at the end of that 3 weeks, it results in the materialization of something. That could be a building, or it could be a pond, or it could be an exhibition, or it could be a radio program, or it could be a publication. But there's always a kind of physical manifestation. And it's also this kind of experiment in living. Obviously, the cooking is very important. We have a very large public events that we can have up to 100 people. We have guest lecturers 3 times a week. And we have great pull to bring amazing people there. So if this is the kind of work that's quite interesting to you, I highly recommend you look up Mildred's Lane. And for me, my work has always had a very strong, it's always been a pedagogic component to the work. And I've always, since 1986, I've pretty much been consistently teaching in one way or another. So part of the development of Mildred's Lane came out of a kind of disappointment in how restrictive art programs were becoming, and the kinds of things that, the kinds of relationships that happened in art school seemed to be quite constrained compared to when I was in school. So Mildred's Lane is a kind of very open discursive space in a sense. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to plug my program. And a lot of schools, maybe someday your school, will sponsor people. Columbia sends people, Art Institute of Chicago sends people, University of Arkansas, University of Washington, MICA, RISD used to, they don't anymore. they say they're broke, right? But so we have a lot of productive partnerships with universities and art schools. Rochelle, if you sent anyone?
No.
Oh, damn. Oh yeah, please.
Is there anything that you're currently working on?
Yeah. I mean, I'm always juggling about 12 different projects, so they're in various stages. So some are, right now I have an exhibition on in Germany, and which is a kind of sculpture exhibition, and I'm developing a big project for the Venice Biennale right now, and I also have a project at Colgate, which is ongoing, which is a process-oriented project where we started. It's called the Wonder Workshop, and so I did a small kind of course introduction on the Curiosity Cabinet and used those marvelous representations we think of from the 16th and 17th century, these engravings, and then with students from the school, we circled objects within those engravings, and then we've been making them out of magic sculpt and paper mache, and as we make them and refine them and turn them into beautifully crafted things, they then get painted with glow-in-the-dark paint and will be installed in this room. So the exhibition had an opening. It has a middle part, which is the Wonder Workshop part, where you come in and the museum has been turned into a studio, and it's very messy and very loud and very boisterous and really fun. And then when everything's finished, we will fill these cabinets and clear out all of the studio part, and you will just have this kind of miraculous kind of dime store alchemy. But yeah, I mean, I'm really working on a lot of projects at the moment. Some site-specific things.
I thought it was, one aspect that was really interesting about your presentation was just the international scale of where you're able to go, and I'm curious, how does somebody graduate and then even to be able to like dream of working in a place like Venice, and do you run into any obstacles being a foreigner, like a foreign agent? I was just curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, to just answer quickly about Venice, so I worked at the Biennale on cleaning these objects for, I guess about 3 or 4 weeks, and then I left. And then I was informed by the pavilion that there were men in suits, and they were putting stickers on everything that said property of the Italian government. And so even though I had the permission from the city of Venice, and I had permission from the archaeology department of the region, I did not have permission from the National Archaeology Department, which I didn't realize. And so they essentially confiscated the entire exhibition. And I had a gallerist in Milan at the time, and I asked her to go and see what was happening. And so she went, and of course I was the American imperialist searching through the treasures of Venice. And of course you have to remember, this goes into the lagoon. All I did was stop this process that happens every day. And so I said, well, should I go and help straighten it out? And she said, Mark, if you come here today, they will put you in jail. And so in the end, we found out that it was actually this museum curator was behind all this. And what he wanted me to donate half of the show to him or to his museum as artwork, not as archaeology. So they kind of made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and I had to give them half the show. But I think the best way to, as a young artist, is just to go. I mean, I just went to Europe, and it felt like for me, Europe was this incredible land of opportunity, and I still think it is. And if I ever have a hole in my schedule, I just show up and knock on doors, and I go to museums, and I introduce myself to the curator, and by the end of the day, either she or me says, so how can we work together? And, I hustle for work all the time. I mean, that never ends. It's really, I'm out there. And for me, what always seemed interesting I had my first exhibitions in New York, and you would do an exhibition and kill yourself for it, and you might even get lucky to have a review, and that would just be that. nothing would be generated from it. Whereas when I did even the smallest thing in Europe, it would generate 2 more things. And those things would generate other things. And so, for me, like, I was very conscious of spending a lot of energy developing my practice in Europe, because it really seemed like there were more, well, first of all, there are just more opportunities. There's just, if you think about a country as small as the Netherlands, every little town has a major museum that supports contemporary work, or a Kunstverein or something. And it just always, I was just always very conscious of what could happen there. And I think you kind of just have to go. Yeah.
I'm not going to the mic, it's too intimidating, actually.
Really? How about if we bring the mic to you? You want to come up to this mic?
I wonder, you never used the word, but I wonder, you didn't use the word, but I wonder if, for an artist, there's a problem with anthropology.
Oh, for an artist, it's a problem with anthropology?
Is it?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't really think about, I think that this work is definitely informed by anthropology in many ways, but I don't really see it as anthropology. But of course, I also don't see it as archaeology, and I certainly don't see it as science. I think that even though, I shadow the methodology of different disciplines, I am not those disciplines. And it's very clear to me, like, in all of these archaeology projects, I have archaeology advisors, right? I have people who make sure that we're never doing the wrong thing, we're never doing harm. And also when I'm working with other institutions, I work a lot with scientists, and it's very clear for them that this is not science, and it's very clear for me it's not science. But sometimes it's not so clear for the art audience, who may have a very limited idea of what science actually is. So that's a really interesting problem in a way. I think that it becomes tricky when the artist tries to be the scientist, or the scientist tries to be the artist. I think that at best we are natural allies, because we have the same enemies, and that's really important, but we're not the same thing, and I think that these kind of collaborations don't work if we try to make science art, or we try to make art science. It has to be something different, and it's very subtle what that is.
Hi, I just have it's kind of random, but I'm just curious. Do you know if maybe your sense of humor kind of evolved over time, having to deal with things like the Italian government or other blips in kind of the process?
I think, I'm not sure my sense of humor evolved, but I think my perspective evolved, but not in a very positive way. I think I'm very, my early work was much more kind of activist oriented and much more kind of optimistic in a way, and I really thought that it was part of, I thought that this was the artistic wing of the wildlife conservation branch, and that part of that was a burden of information. And because I thought that the biodiversity crisis was an information crisis, and I just don't think that was true. I was just wrong. It's really a crisis of will, and I went from thinking that the work would be part of building a culture that could do something, and now I just don't really think actually there is a culture that can do something, and I don't actually think we are going to work it out, So the work, I now see my work more as an exercise in mourning than in anything, in regard to the work that's around wildlife and nature issues, which is really the work I'm most personally interested in, which I actually didn't show very much of that.
Okay. Thanks. The early work on the Tate was quite a rich, or involved quite a rich analytic of display, the various modes of presentation, and you were emphasizing how important process was for you later on, and I wondered if you have an analytic of process evolving or shaping, or that you're working with, or the site, the kind of these specificities of site or place kind of get in the way of that.
Yeah, I don't think I have a very theoretical approach to how I present process. I don't really have a consistent methodology. I mean, for me, it's really important, and it's important to kind of be able to show it in some way, but sometimes I'm better at that. Like projects like the Veldvissen, this giant cabinet, so much of that was about process. But there was really no way to kind of have that as part of the piece. But that's really where all the juicy stuff happens, and I think that's something that was very frustrating in that work in a way, is that you kind of don't see the digging, and you don't see the research, and you don't see the collaborations, and you don't see the absurdity of, finding an iron lung in a storeroom under the railway station that no one has been in 30 years. That's just kind of an incredible process. But, and there are other times where we've been able to do that through a kind of documentation practice, which is maybe a film or something, but that's not terribly satisfying for me. I mean, I think the most satisfying is where you actually have the opportunity to see things being made, which is what's happening now. I mentioned at Colgate, and that's also what we'll do at the Venice Biennale this year. Is the exhibition is a workshop where we are working toward the finished exhibition. So the first Venice, it's really about finished products and more products. So that idea that process is highlighted is kind of an interesting thing for me.
Mark, thank you for an incredibly stimulating presentation. I wondered if I could ask you to speak directly to something that I think you've been alluding to the entire morning, and that is this question of how your interventions as an artist in specific institutional structures lead, if you see it this way, to the production of new knowledge. And I'm sort of interested in how that question of the production of new knowledge functions both in terms of the creation of new artistic discoveries, if you will, and then also if you feel that there is evidence that your interventions are also contributing to shaping discourse in new ways in the sciences or in other disciplines as well.
Thanks.
Thanks.
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think it's always the question of how effective you're being is really hard to gauge in art making, right? And I think if there's one thing you can say is that artists who've worked with museums, and I'm thinking specifically of people like Fred Wilson, Andrea Fraser, Christian Philip Muller, David Wilson, Rosamund Purcell, that our interventions, and sometimes this is under this rubric of institutional critique and sometimes not, that these have really shaped the way museums work today. And they shape the way museums think about their collections, and they shape the way museums interact with artists. And that's a very concrete thing. I mean, there really is like a before mining the museum and an after mining the museum. That's this exhibition that Fred Wilson did, which Lisa Corrin curated. And it showed for the Baltimore Historical Society and for the American Museum Conference that was there at the time in Baltimore, just what are the possibilities for working with an artist to refresh and discuss things in a different way through inviting an artist to collaborate and to dig and to be, in Fred's case, very critical and very and not pull punches in terms of his research in social history. And I think that this is really one of the few areas where you can really look and say, okay, artists were invited, this really changed dramatically museum culture. And I mean, it's just one of the few concrete places where you can point to an exhibition and a series of artist interventions that really did shape the way museums think about what they do in a very positive, very interesting way. And so I think that a lot of that is about also that production of knowledge and the kinds of stories that institutions tell, and what is the sort of benefit from bringing in people from the outside. And there have been just such an explosion of those kinds of projects since then. Thanks.